The herald struck the tide bell twice. The doors of the Pearl Hall swung open, and 400 Vare lords stayed in their seats. They stood for my father. They stood for my sister. For me, for Ilzabel, second daughter of House Veyron, the one the court called the Cinder Princess when they thought the galleries swallowed sound. They had not risen in 5 years, and they did not rise now. I had learned to walk the length of that hall as if their sitting were a kind of weather. You do not argue with rain. You let it fall on you, and you keep your spine straight, and you count the pillars, 14 of them, salt white and veined with iron, and by the 9th pillar, the burning in your face stops being shame and becomes simply heat, which is a thing I know how to carry. That morning there was one man standing. He was off to the side near the engineer's alcove where the legation people waited to give their reports, and he was human. The only human in the hall, broad through the shoulders the way their working men are, hair going iron at the temples, a folder of papers under one arm. He wore the gray coat of the Terran trade legation over coveralls that had been scrubbed but not fooled. I could see the ghost of old scorch marks at the cuffs. He had work gloves folded in his belt, and he stood the way a man stands when a door opens and someone enters the room. Not a bow, not a performance. Just up, on his feet, eyes forward, as though it were the most ordinary motion in the world. And he could not imagine why 400 people had forgotten how to do it. The murmur started at the 3rd pillar and followed me all the way to the dais. I did not look at him again. I had been burned once already. I knew better than to reach back toward anything warm. My father did not let the murmur die on its own. King Othel of the Vare ruled tides, and he ruled silences, and he chose to drown this one with the announcement the whole court had come to hear. The match season of House Veyron is opened, he said, and the hall's attention swung off me like a lamp turned away. The Deepwater locks require an heir's alliance. Suits will be heard for the hand of our daughter. A pause, exactly long enough. Our daughter, Ilzabel. I watched the calculation move through the hall in one slow ripple. The locks, the great tide gates my grandmother built, the throat through which every ship on Caithred's western sea must pass, were my dowry. I was what the dowry was attached to. Lord Cassivar of House Othran was on his feet before the ripple finished, and for him, of course, the protocol bent the other way. The court rose in pieces to honor his rising, which is a trick I have never seen explained in any book of manners. He was beautiful the way his dredge fleet was beautiful, all clean lines and fresh paint and engines you would never be allowed to inspect. House Othran opens the first suit, he said, and bowed to my father, and then, this was the part they would repeat in the corridors for days. His graciousness, he bowed to me. To the princess whose worth the eye alone cannot measure, the court sighed at the elegance of it. It took me 3 heartbeats to unfold the insult from inside the compliment, the way you unfold a blade from a fan. The eye alone cannot measure her worth because the eye, faced with her, must look away. The suits were heard before midday. There were 4. A lord of the kelp shelves examined me through a jeweled lens, the way his stewards examined hull plating, and asked my father's chamberlain, not me, never me, whether the scarring carried, whether it was in the blood, whether daughters of mine would come out marked. Chamberlain Resic assured him it had been honest fire, not blood rot, and the lord made a note in a little book, and I stood there while they discussed the odds of my skin as if I were a tide table. A second lord proposed without ever once raising his face to mine. He addressed the entire suit to the floor tiles, which at least were smooth. The third withdrew upon arrival. He came up the hall, saw me in full light, the left side, where the fire had taken its tithe from jaw and neck and ear, where my black hair grows in a streak of burned silver, and discovered urgent business on the southern shelf. And then Cassivar, who did look at me. That was the thing about him, the thing that made the court coup. He looked at me steadily, warmly, with magnificent, unflinching kindness, the way a man looks at a wreck he intends to buy for salvage. I ask nothing today, he said, but that the princess permit me to be patient. The hall loved him for it. My sister Saveth, 16 and seated below the dais, did not love him. I watched her hands make the small fists they had made since she was a child. My father inclined his head with the first real approval I had seen on him in a season. I made it through the closing courtesies. I made it down the dais steps and out the western door and through 2 corridors of servants who managed to be busy facing elsewhere. And then I went where I have gone since I was 19 years old and freshly out of bandages, when I learned that the only part of Tidereach Palace that never flinched from me was the part below the waterline. The old works lie under the palace like a buried lung, geothermal mains, brine cisterns, the steam galleries that drive the counterweights of the deep water locks and push warmth up through the bones of the palace. My grandmother's work, ancient now, kept alive past its age. The Vare who could service it are 2 generations dead. We became a court that knew how to spend tides, not how to hold them. So we hired humans. Earth runs old steam the way we run old bloodlines, with stubbornness and respect. and a constant low argument against time. I went down the spiral stair into the heat. That is the honest reason I first went, years ago, and it is still half the reason. Heat is kind to burn scars. Cold makes the grafted skin draw tight as drumhide. The steam galleries let me unclench. The other half of the reason is that machinery does not look away. A pressure gauge has no opinion of my face. I expected the galleries empty at midday. They were not. At the south manifold, in a cage of pipe and lamplight, the human from the Pearl Hall stood with his sleeves rolled, one palm laid flat against a mane the way a physician lays a palm on a chest. He heard me on the grating and turned, and I braced, out of habit, out of 5 years of practice, for the flinch. There wasn't one. He looked at the scarred side of my face exactly as long as he looked at the smooth side, which is to say briefly, because mostly he looked at my eyes. "Princess Ilzabel," he said. "Not Highness," drawled like the court draws it, with the little pause where the epithet lives. "My name, plainly, the way you name a colleague. Daniel Mercer, Chief of Steam for the legation. You'll want to mind the rail on the lower walk. She's running hot today." I had walked these galleries 5 years, and no one had ever told me to mind the rail, because no one had ever known I was down here, or cared to. I came down the steps anyway, and out of pure contrariness I set my hand toward the iron rail, and he moved, not to stop me, not to seize my wrist the way a courtier would have, making a small drama of my fragility. He simply pulled the folded gloves from his belt and held them out. "Scar tissue burns faster than it warns you," he said. "You'll have spare nerves there, not extra ones. Take the gloves." I looked at them. Leather, human-made, lined, the fingers shaped by someone else's years of gripping. No one in Titterreach had handed me a practical object since the fire. They handed me veils. They handed me gloves too, once, silk ones, elbow length, from a cousin, with a note about how much easier the court would find things. "You know what burned me?" I asked. It came out flat. It was a test, and I did not know what answer I wanted. "Barge fire 5 years back, on the lock basin," Mercer said. "You went into it for your sister. Everybody down here knows. The fitters still call the South Cistern Stair the Princess's Stair." He said it the way he'd say the pressure rating of a valve, a known fact about a sound piece of equipment. Then he nodded at the rail, at the gloves still held out between us. "Fire's not owed any more of you. Take them." I took them. They were too big and warm from his belt, and my grafted left hand slid into the leather and closed around the hot rail and held it, gripped iron that would have stripped my bare palm, and felt nothing but strength. Above me, the court was drafting marriage contracts for my skin. Below the waterline, a human in work gloves had just told me fire was not owed any more of me, and gone back to listening to a pipe. I stayed an hour. He didn't perform at me, and he didn't manage me. He worked and let me watch, and answered what I asked. The main he was nursing fed the counterweight system of Lock 3. The locks lived or died by these galleries, he said, and the galleries were dying. Not today, not this winter, but the old works had maybe 10 years left in their bones, and his crew of 9 humans was the rag in the wound. "Does my father know?" I asked. "It's in every report I file." He tapped the folder he'd carried in the Pearl Hall. "Reports go up the way heat does, Princess. They thin out as they rise." I laughed, an ugly short sound, out of practice, but real, the first one in longer than I wanted to count. Mercer didn't smile much, I would learn. What he did was easier to trust. He kept talking to you as if you were worth talking to. When I left, I set the gloves on the rail. He picked them up and held them back out to me. "Keep 'em," he said. "You come down here more than I do. That's plain from how you walk the gratings." And then evenly, with no weight on it at all, the sentence I carried back up all 14 flights like a coal cupped in my hands. "This part of the palace works better when somebody from the family knows how it runs. Somebody from the family, not the marked one, not the cinder. A daughter of the house that built this place, standing in its deep rooms, learning its valves." That night, at the betrothal season banquet, Lord Cassavar toasted the restoration of beauty to House Veyron's table, and the court drank, and my father let him be seated at my left side, my scarred side, a graciousness, the lords murmured. "Look how he does not even ask to be moved." Cassavar leaned close over the brine fruit and spoke low, for me alone, in the voice underneath his voice. "They tell me you wander the cellars, Highness. I'd give that up before the contracts are signed. A wife of Othran will be looked at. We'll have the veil makers attend to the rest." He smiled his fleet-launched smile and rose to applause, to toast my father. I sat very still, the way I had learned, and counted pillars. Under the table, out of sight, my left hand was still curled to the shape of a hot iron rail it had held without pain, and I thought, there is one room in this palace where I am not the wreck being bought for salvage, and the match season had only begun. The gloves lived in the lining of my cloak after that, and I went down the next day and the day after, and Mercer never once asked why a princess kept turning up in his galleries. He handed me a lamp the second day and a logbook the fourth, and by the end of the first week, I was reading gauges aloud while he bled condensate off the long run, and the strangest thing about it was how unstrange he made it. The second week I corrected his map. His crew worked from survey charts the legation had drawn when they took the contract. Careful, wrong in 3 places. The old works were not built so much as grown, my grandmother adding galleries the way other queens added wings, and the charts showed the brine cisterns as a dead end off the south stair. They are not a dead end. Behind third cisterns there is a dry crawl my grandmother cut for her own inspectors, and it comes out above the Lock 3 counterweight vault, and a 5-year ghost of those galleries knows it the way she knows her own hallway in the dark. You're certain, Mercer said, when I drew it on his chart in grease pencil. I've used it 100 times. It cuts the South Circuit by 20 minutes. He didn't pat the information, or me, on the head. He took a lamp and made me walk him through it every meter, testing the air at the low points, sounding the old shoring with his knuckles like a man knocking on the door of the dead queen who built it. At the far end, where the crawl led out onto the vault gantry and the counterweight chains rose out of black water like the rigging of something drowned, he stood a long moment in the lamplight, looking at 20 saved minutes. Briggs, he said that evening to his second, a long-boned young man with a Terran Island accent, amend the charts. Princess found us a service way the survey missed. Found us, not showed us where she hides. The fitters looked at me differently after that, not the court's look, slid sideways off the scars, but the workshop's look, weighed and filed. Knows the galleries, useful. There were 9 of them, and they were the first 9 people in 5 years to be visibly glad when I came into a room, and I would have traded a great deal not to learn how much that moved me. Upstairs, the season ground on, and Cassivar courted the way his house dredged, thoroughly in public with beautiful machinery. He sent gifts calculated to be talked about. The one the court still sighs over was the veil, Othran tide silk, gray as morning fog, woven with silver wire, worth a fishing village. It came with a card in his own elegant hand, so that the princess may meet every gaze with comfort. The ladies of the court called it the kindest thing they had ever seen. It took them no time at all to begin watching my bare face at table, with a new question in their eyes. Why does she make us look at it, when he has so generously paid for the curtain? That is the craft of a man like Cassivar. He never threw a stone in his life. He builds you a beautiful door to a smaller room, and the world calls him generous, and waits for you to be grateful enough to walk in. My sister came to my chambers the night the veil arrived. Savith, who the fire never touched because I got to her first, sat on the end of my bed the way she used to before the world decided I had become difficult to look at, and pulled the veil through her fists like she meant to find its seam and tear it. You know what he is, she said. Issa, everyone our age knows what he is. There was a girl of House Marin, they married her up to the northern shelf and called her unfit inside 2 years, and now the house signs her letters for her. Othran writes those contracts. It's what they do. They marry water rights, not women. I know what he is, I said. Father doesn't care what he is. Father knows exactly what he is, I said, and it was the bitterest sentence I had ever allowed myself about the king. That's why it works. A lord that's smooth will keep the locks running and the scandal quiet. He's not selling me to a monster, Sai. He's selling me to a manager. I folded the veil back into its box. Monsters you can show the court. Managers smile at your table for 40 years. Savith was quiet then. You went into the fire and I didn't even scream. Did you know that? I couldn't make a sound. Everyone on the basin was screaming, and the one person walking in was you. Her hands made their small fists. They stopped standing for you, and I never once stood up and made them. I think about that every time those doors open. You were a child. I'm not now, she said, and left me with that. I will be honest about what I did with all of it, because this is the part of the story where I was still a coward. I did nothing. I had been 5 years learning that resistance costs and silence is cheaper, and I had a room below the waterline where none of it could follow me, and I told myself that was enough, that a woman could live on an hour, dignity a day, taken like medicine. I went down to the galleries, I learned valves, I let the season grind. It was the heat that broke my arithmetic, in the end. The small, stupid, ordinary heat. My wing of the palace, the southeast face, the rooms I had been moved to after the fire, far from the family floors so my recovery would be restful, had been cold for 3 winters. The radiant pipes in those walls ran lukewarm at best, stone dead at worst, and 3 winters of requests to Chamberlain Resic had produced 3 winters of regrets. The old works were failing, Highness. Everyone knew that. The legation crew was stretched. The family floors had priority, perhaps additional braziers. I slept in wool like a shepherd and understood perfectly. Failing heat was a fact about a dying system. Facts have no address. You cannot accuse a pipe. It came up by accident, in the galleries, on a day I'd carried down 2 of the brazier's charcoal sacks for the fitter's stove. Mercer watched me stack them and asked in his flat way why the southeast wing's princess was hauling fuel like a deckhand, and I said something light about my rooms running cold, the system being what it was. Old pipes, everyone knew. He went still in the way I had learned meant he was reading something, a gauge, a sound in a main, a sentence. Southeast face, he said. Second riser. He walked the length of the distribution headers, my grandmother's iron flowers, each one feeding a limb of the palace, and he laid his hand on the second riser's valve and looked at it for a moment, and then he looked at the seal hung on it. A steward's lockout tag, Palace Authority, years faded. Your rooms aren't cold because the works are failing, Princess, he said. Your riser's been throttled at the header, by hand. Tag so my crew wouldn't touch it. He turned the tag over with one gloved finger, and his voice stayed level the way iron stays level. Somebody upstairs decided which rooms get winter. I stood there in the heat of the gallery with 3 years of polite regrets rearranging themselves in my chest into one cold, clean shape. Not neglect, housekeeping. Somewhere above, a steward had weighed the cost of warming the marked daughter nobody stood for, and had reached past a dozen working valves to close mine, and the court's only effort in the matter had been the choosing of words for the regrets. Don't, I said when his hand moved to the seal. If you break a palace tag, they'll have your contract. I'll petition the Chamberlain. Mercer looked at me. In 2 weeks I had seen him patient with bad iron, patient with green fitters, patient with a court that read his reports the way gulls read books. I had not yet seen the other thing in him, the thing under the patience, and it was very quiet and it did not blink. You've petitioned 3 winters, he said. I file a maintenance order tonight. Header rebalance per original commission spec, that's your grandmother's spec. It's in my contract annex, and her spec says every wing of this house gets heat. No tag outranks the commission. He snapped the seal off its wire and put it in his breast pocket, deliberate as a man pocketing evidence, because that is exactly what he was doing. Let them come argue the paperwork with me. I'd enjoy it. I woke at dawn to a sound I did not recognize and lay still until I placed it. The tick and knock of warm iron stretching inside walls that had been silent for 3 years. Heat rose through my rooms like a tide coming back to a stranded pool. I put my burned hand flat on the pipe shroud, and I am not ashamed to say I wept briefly, efficiently, in the manner of someone long out of practice, not for the warmth, but for the sentence that had come with it the night before, down in the lamplight, from a man reopening a valve that was never his to fight for. Her spec says every wing of this house gets heat. The court never heard about the riser, but courts are bodies of water. Pressure moves through them unseen. Within days the servants knew, they always know first, that the human steam chief had broken a steward's seal for the Cinder Princess and dared the Chamberlain's office to object. And the Chamberlain's office, after one look at the commission annex, had not objected. The first sign of the shift was small. It was Pell, the undermaid who laid my fires, 16 years old, scar on her own wrist from a kitchen accident, who had never in her life met my eyes. I came into my rooms one evening, and she did not duck out, flattening herself to the wall as the staff were quietly trained to do around me, sparing themselves. She put down the kindling basket and stood, faced me chin level, ears burning, the full formal stand of a Veyer servant when the blood of the house enters a room. Highness, she said, loud enough to be a declaration somewhere. 2 of us now, I remember thinking, absurd and precise. 1 human and 1 undermaid. As armies go, it was not much. But I had spent 5 years learning exactly how many people it takes to make a hall feel empty, and so I knew better than the court did what it means when the number begins, even slowly, to run the other way. The Deepwater Concord came round that spring, as it does every 9th year. The treaty gathering where every house and harbor that lives off the Locke sends its delegations to Tittereach to renew the tolls, swear the water oaths, and eat my father's kitchens bare for a month. The palace filled like a flood basin, banners of 40 houses, hulls of 30 fleets standing into the lock basin day after day, and my father, who understood spectacle the way Mercer understood steam, decided the Concord would close with a betrothal. His marked daughter, redeemed into usefulness, contracted to the lord of the dredge fleets with half the Western Sea watching. Nothing was announced. Everything was understood. The season had been a formality. The Concord was the deadline. Cassivar moved into the palace with his household a month early as principal guest. With him came his aide, Master Tobin, a narrow gray-skinned man with a surveyor's eyes who appeared wherever information pooled. Kitchens, docks, the Chamberlain's office, and twice, which interested me later, at the head of the spiral stair above the old works, looking down into the heat as if pricing it. It was at the Concord's opening banquet that Cassivar made his mistake with Mercer. I have thought about that night many times since, because a more patient cruelty would have left the human alone, and everything after might have gone to Autran's plan. But men like Cassivar cannot leave a fixed point unbent. It offends them, the way a level floor offends water. The legation was seated far down the hall, below the salt, as we say, among harbor masters and pilots, working guests. My father had called the steam chief up to the high tables to answer for the winter readiness of the locks, because 3 delegations had asked, because their fleets were sitting in his basin. Mercer came as he was, clean coat, plain manner, gloves folded in his belt even there. He gave the condition of the works in 8 sentences, no varnish, what would hold, what was tired, what the next decade demanded, and the hall heard it in the way courts hear unwelcome competence, with respect arriving disguised as discomfort. Casavar laughed into the pause that followed. A warm laugh, an including laugh, his cup raised. A thorough accounting, he said. Your trade suits you, steam chief. Tell us, before we set the fates of 40 houses by your gauges, whose man are you? Name us your line. Your father's standing. The Vare like to know what blood is advising their king. A ripple of amusement, the comfortable kind, ran along the high tables. Everyone understood the move. The human was being asked to recite the only poverty a court can never forgive, that nobody important had made him. Mercer stood easy and let the amusement spend itself, and I watched him decide, I know now what I was watching, that the truth would do. My father drove freight, he said. 41 years, never lost a load. My mother kept the books for a harbor smaller than your smallest. I can't name my line past her grandmother. He said it the way he reported pressure, and the hall readied itself to be delighted by the admission. Then he went on. What I can name is every man and woman who taught me my trade. 40 years of them, the fitter who taught me to listen to iron before I trust it, the engineer who taught me you check the work, not the reputation. I can name them the way your houses name kings, because that's what they are to me. That's the line I come from. He glanced very briefly at the great header diagrams of the locks engraved on the hall's far wall, my grandmother's. Iron, the system his 9 people kept alive. It's the line that's been keeping your water where you want it. I'll send up the winter schedule in the morning. Silence holds shapes in a hall like that. This one held a shape I had not felt in years. The court, mid-law, discovering it was laughing at the only person in the conversation who had answered the question with assets. Down among the harbor masters somebody, a pilot, they never found out who, rapped the table twice in the dockside way of agreeing with a sounding, and the rap ran along the low tables like a spark down a fuse before the steward's glares put it out. Old Admiral Veshtain, my grandmother's last living lock warden, 90 if she was a day, nodded once over her cup publicly, where everyone could bank it. Casavar smiled and toasted the legation's diligence, gracious to the last visible degree, and I, who had spent a season learning the voice underneath his voice, saw the ledger open behind his eyes and a debt written into it under the human's name. He collected the first installment within the week. It began, as his methods began, with no stone thrown and no hand shown. A regulator on the western feed failed at shift change and put a fan of live steam across a Vare fitter's arm. Palace fitter, not legation. A man named Corse, one of the locals Mercer had been training because 9 humans cannot crew a buried lung forever. Corse would keep the arm. The Whisper did not care. The Whisper, moving through the Concord crowds with remarkable lungs, said the humans were stretched past competence, said the savage old system was beyond them, said the steam chief gave fine speeches at banquets while his work scalded honest Vare. Within 2 days, a delegation formally asked my father whether lock operations ought to pass to a house with modern fleet, and there was only one house at the Concord with modern fleet, and it had been courting me all season. I was in the galleries when Mercer stripped the failed regulator on a bench, Briggs at his shoulder, and I watched his hand stop. Briggs, the seat ring. Briggs looked and whistled low. I came around the bench. The regulator's seat ring, the part whose failure had loosed the steam, had not worn through. It had parted along a line too clean for fatigue, a line with the faint chatter marks of a cutting tool, dressed afterward to look like crystallized age, unless you had spent 40 years learning to listen to iron before you trust it. Machine to fail, I said. The words tasted like cold water. Machine to fail on a timer you can't predict? By somebody who knew we just trained local fitters onto that shift, Mercer said. Heard of air, not a human better. He did not rage. I had braced for rage, and what came was worse and better at once. He went methodical. Photographs, measurements, the part bagged and tagged and locked in the legation's document safe. Every step entered in his log in a hand like stitching. Princess, I can't prove a name with this. A cut ring tells you intent, not address. If I take it upstairs now, it's the desperate excuse of a foreign crew under scrutiny. They'll have my contract by the tide after. Then what do you do with it? What you do with a first crack. He closed the log, mark it, watch the line it wants to run. A man who cuts one ring has already paid for the second. Sabotage is like any other engineering, Princess. Nobody builds for a single load. His eyes came up to mine, and there was the quiet thing again, the unblinking thing under the patience. And I start walking my galleries at hours nobody expects, including the crawl your grandmother cut. You're going to teach my whole crew that route. So the weeks of the Concord ran on 2 floors at once, and I lived on the stairs between them. Above banquets, oath-swearings, Casivar at my left hand being magnificently patient, the contract drifting toward me like weather off the sea, my father's glances telling me the date was chosen if not yet spoken. Below, lamplit watches, the crew walking the mains in pairs, Mercer teaching me valves with a thoroughness I understood eventually was not a courtesy. He was the only person in Teeterreach preparing me for something rather than packaging me for it. And in between, on the stairs, the third thing grew, the thing with no name on any floor. Pell stood for me, and then the laundry mistress did, and then, with the suddenness of a custom remembering itself, the lower service halls did. All of them, every time, while the Pearl Hall kept its seats. The court noticed and found it amusing. The scullery rises for the cinder, one of Casivar's lieutenants said at cards, not knowing a page was in earshot, or knowing. When it reached me, I waited to feel shame and found, to my considerable surprise, that the room had run out of it. You can only burn so far down. Somewhere under the graphs there is bedrock. It was Savith who put words to what was actually happening one night on the southeast stairs, having come down to walk me up from the galleries with a lamp like we were girls again. "You've stopped counting pillars," she said. "You used to walk that hall like you were doing sums, now you walk it like him." She did not have to say who, like you're checking whether the floor's level. "Issa, whatever you're learning down there, learn it faster." Father told Resic to draft for the Concords last night. Her hand found my sleeve in the lamplight, and her voice went young. "They're going to read the betrothal under the water oaths, where refusing is treason to the treaty. He's not leaving you a door." I stood on my grandmother's stairs, between the court that would not rise for me and the deep rooms that had, and I felt the dateland like a load coming onto a main. 11 days. Whatever I was going to be, I had 11 days to finish becoming it. 3 days after Savith's warning, my father gave the Concord its centerpiece spectacle. A state inspection of the deep water locks themselves. 40 houses worth of delegates walked along the great seawall to be shown the machine their tolls were sworn to. He brought me, of course. The dowry walks with the asset. I was placed in the procession between my father and Casivar, and Casivar performed ownership for 2 hours with a delicacy that would have been invisible to anyone who had not spent a season learning him. A hand indicating the gates as if introducing them, the word soon dropped twice where the harbor masters could hear it. My grandmother's iron narrated in the future tense of House Authorend's stewardship. At the crown of Lock 3, a delegate of the Eastern Shelf, a sharp old woman who owned more grain hulls than my father owned banners, asked the question the whole walk had been circling. With the works aged as the morning's reports confessed, what was the true margin on the counterweight system at spring tide? How close did the gates run to their limits with a full festival basin? It was a real question, asked by someone whose fortune rode on the answer, and it fell into the procession like a wrench dropped down a stairwell. My father looked to Resic. Resic looked to the court engineers, two well-born Vair who held the title the way one holds an inherited sword, decoratively. They began an answer with no numbers in it, all reassurance and tide blessings, and the old woman's face shut like a ledger. Mercer was there in his working grays, present as all contractors are present at inspections, available and ignored. He did not step forward. He did something I have thought about many times since, because it cost him an opening any ambitious man would have taken. He looked at me. The whole walking court was foundering on a question whose answer I knew from his own logbooks, knew from a season of gauges, knew the way I knew my own stairways. And the only person on that seawall who realized it was the human, and the human held my eyes and very slightly, very plainly waited. He could have answered and been the indispensable foreigner. He passed me the wrench instead. "The margin at spring tide is 11 parts in 100, I said, and the procession turned as one animal. It was 19 when the system was commissioned. The deep boilers lose roughly half a part each year, which is the arithmetic. The morning reports were written politely around. At the present rate of decline, the gates fall below safe working margin within 9 years. Within 5 if next winter is as hard as this one was. The full survey is in the legation's quarterly reports." I let that breathe, then finished it. "They make instructive reading, my lady. I recommend the appendices. They thin as they rise." The old shipowner looked at me, at my eyes, the way one looks at the person in the room who has the numbers, and asked her follow-up to my face. Then a second question, from a harbor master. Then a third. For perhaps 6 minutes, on the crown of my grandmother's lock, in front of the Western Sea, the Cinder Princess held a technical court, and Mercer of the legation stood off my shoulder confirming figures like a second, and the delegation scribes wrote down what the marked daughter said because no one else on the seawall could say it. 6 minutes. Then my father, smiling the state smile, observed that his daughter had inherited the Queen Maravel's fascinations and the procession was moved along to the banquet pavilion, and the lecture was over. But I had seen the scribe's writing. Pressure moves through courts unseen, and somewhere in 40 houses' inspection notes there now lived a line that had never existed before. The burned princess knows the works. Cassivar congratulated me at the pavilion, warmly, where the delegates could see the graciousness. Then he fell in beside me on the walk back along the seawall, slowed his step until the procession thinned ahead of us, and spent his charm down to the bare iron beneath it. 11 parts in 100, he said pleasantly. You've been getting your figures below the waterline. From the human and his 9 men, he watched the gates as he spoke, proprietary. Here is a figure of mine, Highness. 1. That is the number of reports it takes. 1 report from 1 physician of standing on the strain evident in a fire-damaged bride who haunts cellars at night among foreign workmen, to move a wedding date forward considerably. Your father would sign it out of kindness. The court would call it mercy. He turned the fleet-launched smile on me, and for the first time he let me see all the way down it, to the dredge chains. I have been patient, as I promised. I am telling you courteously, between houses that patience is a budget. Walk where you like until the oaths, princess. But understand that every stair you take down is an entry in a file. And files, he bowed, gracious for the rejoining crowd, are read aloud eventually. He left me at the pavilion entrance with my heart going like a fouled pump, not from fear or not only, from recognition. He had just told me in his own dialect that I had become worth threatening. 5 years of being beneath the court's notice, and the season I finally stepped out of it, the first acknowledgement came from the enemy. You are no longer negligible. You are now a problem to be filed. I told Mercer that evening at the bench all of it. The threat, the physician, the file. He listened with his hands still, which from him was a shout. He made a mistake today, he said at last. 2. He told you his timing pressure. A man who threatens to move a date is a man whose plan needs the date. And he told you he's watching the galleries. He closed the logbook and looked at me with the quiet thing fully awake behind his eyes. From tonight, my crew walks you to the stairhead. Every visit, 2 of them logged. Not because you need mining, princess, because witnesses cut both ways. He wants a file on you. He set his glove flat on the closed log like a man taking an oath on it. Fine, we keep a better one. The draft contract reached my hands on the 8th day before the oaths, and it reached them crooked, which is to say, not from my father, not from Resic, but from Keeper Onave, the palace archivist who was required by law to enter all house contracts into the deep registry and who was, I had forgotten, the 3rd person in Teeterreach who had begun standing when I entered a room. The registry is below the waterline too, 1 level above the galleries, a vault of salt-cured paper and patience. I had passed its door for 5 years on my way to the steam. The old keeper had watched me pass, it turned out, the whole time. Read it here, Onave said, laying the draft on the registry table under the good lamp. He was ancient, folded like a seabird, with ink stains older than my father's reign. It enters the registry tomorrow, and after that it is a house instrument, and showing it to you becomes a different act than showing it to you. Tonight it is just paper on my table, and you are just a daughter of the house with a right to the registry. He paused, dry as his paper. Most of your rights are smaller than you've been told, Highness. A few are very much larger. It is a keeper's grief that the family only ever asks about the small ones. I read the contract. The shape of it was beautiful, which I expected. Otherin's clerks write the way Cassivar smiles. The marriage portion, the alliance of fleets, the joint administration of the deep-water locks. Veyrune's sovereignty preserved on the face of every clause. The blade was in the annexes. And even forewarned by Saveth's story of the Marin girl, I had to read the 3rd annex twice before I believed they had dared to write it down. Care provisions. In the event the Lady Ilzavel be found by physicians of standing, unfit of body or mind to discharge the duties of her station, and what duties those were, the annex left gracefully undefined. Administration of her dowry holdings passes in trust to her lord husband for the term of the unfitness. The physicians of standing to be appointed by mutual agreement of both houses. There followed, in the dry-tide script of the schedules, the names of 4 physicians already agreed. 2 of them drew Otherin stipends. The 3rd had written, in a treatise the court had found very moving some years ago, that severe disfigurement by fire was known to scar the spirit as deeply as the skin, rendering the afflicted unsuited to the strains of public station. They were not buying the wreck for salvage. They were buying the wreck with the verdict already drafted, the unfitness already commissioned, the trust clause already aimed at the locks. A year of marriage, 2 for decency, then the petition, the sad findings, the lord husband bearing up bravely as his wife was retired to the northern shelf for her health, and the throat of the western sea passed in trust to House Otherin. My father would get his alliance, Cassivar would get the locks, and the court would get the ending it had always wanted for me. The marked daughter tenderly put away, no longer making anyone look at her. I sat in the registry lamplight with my hands flat on the annex, and I want to be exact about what I felt, because it was not the despair I had budgeted for. It was colder and more useful. It was the feeling I'd had at Mercer's bench, looking at the chatter marks on the cut ring. The relief of the engineer finally allowed to see the failure plain. Intent, not weather. An address, not a fact. You cannot accuse a pipe, I had told myself for 3 winters. Lying, here was the pipe with a name signed under it. Keeper, I said. You told me some of my rights are larger than I've been told. I am asking about the large ones. Aneve's old ears tipped forward, and for a moment he looked the way Mercer looked at a sound main, like a craftsman watching something finally take load. He went into the deep stacks and was gone a quarter hour and came back with a volume bound in whale iron, the registry of crown grants, and with a folio of loose leaves in my grandmother's own hand. The Ember right, he said. Grant of Queen Marivelle, your grandmother, in the 11th year of the Lox's building. Properly, the right of the Flameborn. He opened the volume to a page he found without looking. She wrote it for her lock builders, Highness, after the South Cason fire. 17 workers went into that fire to hold the gates, and 9 came out, and some of those 9 were women whose families tried afterward to retire them quietly, scarred as they were, and marry their pensions into other houses' keeping. Your grandmother was displeased. The dry voice gave the word its full weight. So she granted this as crown law, sworn into the Concord itself so no later king could quietly drown it, that any person who has borne fire in service of the blood or works of House Veyroon shall hold their lands, pensions, and persons in their own name, fit or unfit, whole or marked, and shall not be contracted in marriage, trust, or guardianship save by their own consent, spoken in their own voice, before the court. He turned the volume to face me. It has been invoked 14 times. 12 lock workers, 1 kitchen girl, and 1 prince of this house, your grandmother's brother, burned at the engine trials. It has never once been overturned. It cannot be. It's load-bearing now. Half the dock pensions on the Western Sea stand on its precedent. Strike the Ember right and 40 houses' own veterans lose title with it. Not even Authren's clerks would put a saw to that branch. And it sleeps in your registry, I said, while they draft annexes. It sleeps in my registry, Anev agreed, because the family asks about the small rights. The court remembers the law it uses, Highness. The rest waits down here with me, below the waterline. He let that sit, then added carefully, a keeper to the inn. I can attest the grant. I cannot attest your standing under it. The right requires that the fire be witnessed and the service sworn to before the court by those who saw it. You went into the barge fire for the blood of this house. The whole basin watched you do it. But watching and standing up to swear are different acts, as Highness knows better than anyone in Tidereach. The old eyes were steady on me. You will need witnesses willing to rise. Witnesses willing to rise, I almost laughed. 5 years, and the whole of my question had finally been put into 4 words by an archivist. I did not sleep that night. I sat by my warm pipes with my grandmother's loose folio. Aneve had pressed it on me at the door. Irregular, he'd muttered, delighted with himself, and I read Queen Marivelle's working notes in her square engineer's hand. Caisson loads, tide tables, and between them, undated, a single paragraph that has lived in me every day since. They tell me the scarred ones distress the court at festivals, she wrote, and ask my leave to seat them apart. I have answered that the court is seated in a hall my scarred ones built, and may take its distress up with the roof beams. A house that cannot look at its own keel does not deserve the water it floats on. In the morning I went down to the galleries and told Mercer all of it. The annex, the physicians, the Ember right, the witnesses. I had not planned to tell him all of it. It had simply become, without my deciding, the place where I took true things to find out how much load they'd bear. He listened the way he listened to iron, not interrupting, and when I finished, he was quiet a moment. On Earth, we'd call that contract elder fraud with a wedding attached, he said. Your grandmother's law is good engineering, prepositioned, redundant, anchored into the same foundation as everyone else's pensions, so nobody pull it without bringing their own wall down. He looked at me. You know I'll stand and swear. I wasn't at your fire, so my oath's worth nothing to the right. But chorus will rise. Half the palace fitters are basin men. They watched you come out of that barge with your sister. Veshtain was lock warden that day. She signed the casualty rolls. The underhalls would stand for you to a soul. But the right says before the court, and that's the cost of it, princess. It has to be done in the Pearl Hall in the open, against your father's wishes and Authren's contract, in front of the 400 who don't rise. There's no service stare to this one. I know, I said. And then, because the galleries were the one room where true things got said plainly, I said the rest of it. I've spent 5 years learning to need nothing from that hall. If I do this, I'm asking it for something again, in public, with my face up, And if they sit through it, if I invoke my grandmother's law and the hall just sits, I found my hands had closed on the gantry. Rail, gloved, gripping. I lived through the fire, Mercer. I planned around the marriage. I don't actually know if I lived through that. He didn't mean the hall would rise. That is the thing I have never stopped being grateful for. He was not in the business of forecasting other people's decency. He looked at my gloved hands on his rail and then at me and he said, in exactly the voice he used for pressure ratings, 5 years ago you walked into a fire nobody ordered you into for somebody you loved. The court's just a colder fire, princess. And this time you don't go in alone, you've got a crew. He picked up his wrench, turned back to the main, and added the sentence he would have denied was tender. Besides, I've seen what your hands hold. The rail's hot. Grip it anyway. 8 days to the water oaths. I went up the spiral stair with my grandmother's folio under my arm, and for the first time in 5 years I did not count the pillars when I crossed the Pearl Hall. I measured the room like a load to be carried, and I noted where my witnesses would stand, and I began, quietly below the waterline of the court's attention, to build. My father summoned me the morning after I read the annexes, before I had decided how to use them, and that interview deserves its place in this account, because it is the closest I ever came to abandoning the whole structure. He received me in the chart room, not the audience chamber, the room where Veyroon kings do their real arithmetic, tide tables on every wall, my grandmother's original lock drawings in their iron frames. He stood me across the plotting table like a delegation and informed me, with no cruelty and no warmth, of what I already knew. The betrothal would be read at the water oaths under the Concord's witness in 6 days. House Othren's contract was generous. The matter was settled. I've read the contract, I said. Annex 3. The care provisions, the physicians, the trust clause aimed at the locks. Father, they have written my unfitness in advance. They have named the doctors who will find it. You are not signing a marriage. You are signing the verdict and the sentence with a 2-year delay for decency. I had imagined, on the stairs up, that this would land like the wedge collars had landed, that he had not read it, that the shape of the trap, once shown, would do its own work. He did not even reach for the contract to check the annex. And that is how I learned, standing across the plotting table in that quiet room, the true depth of the water I had been swimming in all my life. I know what it says, my father said. He had read it. He had read it and weighed it and signed toward it anyway. And now he laid out his arithmetic for me with the tide tables at his back, evenly, like a man with nothing to be ashamed of, which is the only way shame of that size can be carried. The locks were failing, yes. He had read the legation's appendices too. He read everything. The king reads everything. The crown could not fund the rebuilding alone. The Concord would not raise tolls for a house that looked weak. Othren's fleet and treasury could. The marriage put Othren's strength inside the family wall. And if, he said years from now, the worst of the annex were ever invoked, then you would be kept, Ilzeville, comfortably, quietly, for life on the northern shelf. Away from all of this. Is that so far from what you have chosen for yourself already? You live below the waterline by your own will. They would simply make it official. He set down the rule he had been holding, and for one moment something old moved in his face. I lost your mother to the deep water and half my daughter to the fire. What I am buying with this contract is the certainty that no one can ever take the rest. He cannot hurt you, child, if everything he could take from you is already in his trust. That is the only safety I know how to purchase. There it was, complete. Not a king who had failed to see the trap, a king who had seen it and decided that a trap with soft walls was the best home remaining for a daughter the world had stopped standing for. He would sell the locks to keep me safe and call the selling safety, and underneath it, where he could not look, lived the simpler sentence, the one the whole court had been built on for 5 years. She is damaged, and damaged things are stored, not sailed. Mother told me once that you stood for 3 hours in the basin watch the night I was born, I said. My voice was level, her iron even then. Grandmother offered you her own chair and you refused it, because the watch stands. You told that story at every name day I had until the fire. You have not told it since. He went very still. I am not asking you for the locks, Father. I am not even asking you to break the contract. I am telling you, as your daughter and as the only person in this palace who has read both Annex 3 and Grandmother's commission spec, that 6 days from now I will be in the Pearl Hall, and something is going to be read there. And when it is read, you are going to have to decide, in front of the Western Sea, with no chart room and no arithmetic, whether the watch stands. I bowed to him then, court perfect, the bow of a delegation taking its leave. You taught me the rule yourself, Majesty. I learned it. I have simply had to go below the waterline to find anyone who still keeps it. I was at the door when he spoke, and he did not turn from the tide tables to say it, and his voice had the grain in it that came later, before the court, on the night everything stood. What will be read? Ask the keeper what sleeps in your registry, I said. The family only ever asks about the small rights. Ask him about the large ones. He did not summon Anave that day, or the next. Kings come to the registry slowly. Arithmetic that old does not revise in an afternoon. But on the third day, Anave told me this at the docketing. Dry as ever, refusing to make it tender, which made it more so, the king of the Ver appeared below the waterline in the registry vault for the first time in his reign alone, and asked the keeper for the grant of Queen Marivelle, 11th year of the locks. And he stood at the reading table, Anave said, there being chairs available, and read the ember write twice through in silence, and the working notes folio after it. And when he came to some line in his mother's square engineer's hand, he put his thumb against it on the page, and stayed that way for a long moment, the way a man checks a level or a pulse. He left without a word. The betrothal reading stayed on the order of ceremonies. The contract stayed in the docket. My father, to the last hour, kept every option on his table. He was a king before he was anything else, and I have given up expecting that sentence to stop costing me to write. But Anav, locking the vault that evening, found that the king's seal ring had been pressed, in passing, into the soft old wax at the foot of the grant's registry page. The mark a Veyroon's sovereign leaves on a law he has personally verified, a mark with no legal force at all, the registry equivalent of a man rapping a table twice in the dockside way. Whatever he decided in the chart room afterward, whatever arithmetic survived, he had gone down into the deep rooms and touched the keel his mother built, and some part of him had signed. The galleries, meanwhile, ran their lamplit watches, and twice more the night crew found chalk ghosts near the western feed. Faint survey marks with no survey behind them, rubbed out by morning, in places only a man pricing the iron would ever stand. Mercer logged them, photographed them, left them undisturbed, and studied the second set a long time with his jaw set. He's measuring something, was all he said. Walk soft, princess, and keep your gloves on you. 5 days to the oaths. I had a sleeping law in the registry, a king with wax on his thumb, and a hall that sat. What remained was the building, and the building could not be done below the waterline. It meant going out with my face up to ask. Building meant witnesses, and witnesses meant asking, and asking meant walking into rooms with my face up and saying the words I had spent 5 years, engineering my life never to need. I require something from you, and you may refuse me. I did it 11 times in 4 days. Course, his arm still dressed, heard me out in the fitter's mess and stood up before I finished the question. Stood formally in the old way, which in a one-room mess with 4 people watching was its own small pearl hall. Basin men remember, Highness, was all he said. Admiral Veshtain received me among her charts, listened with her spotted hands folded, and was silent so long I braced for the courteous refusal. I signed 17 names onto casualty rolls of the South Cason fire when I was a lieutenant, she said at last. Your grandmother made me read them aloud to the court before she granted the right. The court sat for that too at first. She looked up, and 90 years of weather looked with her. I have wondered for 5 years whether anyone would ever ask me. Yes, child, I will rise and swear. Pell asked me to teach her the oath's words so she would not stumble on them. Anav entered my petition into the deep registry's docket in his stitching hand and dated it for the night of the water oaths, the last night of the Concord, the same hour as the betrothal reading. Collision scheduling, he said, dry as ever. A keeper's one vice. And that might have been the story. My grandmother's law against Authrain's annex, witnesses against contract, decided on the floor of the Pearl Hall by whatever the court found in itself when an old admiral stood. That was the load path I had built for. But Cassivar, as Mercer had said at the bench, had already paid for the second ring. And on the 6th night, 2 days before the oaths, the old works tried to die. I was in the galleries when it began, late past middle night, helping Briggs log the evening pressures, because sleep and I had given up on each other that week. The first sign was nothing. A flutter in the needle on the lock 3 counterweight main, a tremor you would not see unless an iron-voiced man had spent a season teaching you that needles speak. Briggs saw my face and looked, and stopped breathing for a moment, and reached for the speaking pipe to the legation quarters. And that flutter is the only reason any of what follows was survivable. We were already watching when the Western Relief manifold let go. It did not explode. Steam systems rarely grant you anything so honest. The relief manifold, the bank of valves whose whole purpose is to spill pressure safely when the mains run high, jammed itself closed across 4 of its 6 seats all at once, in the same night that the firing control on the deep boilers stuck at full draw. 2 failures, independent systems, opposite ends of the galleries, the same hour. The mains began to climb, and in the lock basin above us, riding at festival moorings in the dark, sat the assembled fleets of 40 houses, on water held back by gates whose counterweights hung from my grandmother's steam. Mercer came down the spiral stair 4 minutes after Briggs whistled up the pipe in his nightshirt with his work coat over it, gloves already on. He read the board once, needles climbing in their slow choir, and I watched 40 years of craft compress into a triage that took him 8 seconds. Firing control first. Starve the fire, the climb slows, we buy half an hour. Briggs, take course and kill the draw at the boilers. Hand trip if the linkage fights you. The manifold's the war. If those seats are jammed the way I think they're jammed, they were helped. His eyes came to me, and there was no protocol left in them, only arithmetic. Princess, the crawl. The manifold gallery's a 40-minute walk by the South Circuit, and we don't have 40 minutes. Your grandmother's crawl puts a crew above it in 12. You're the only one who's walked it in the dark. Then stop talking about it, I said, and took the lead lamp off its hook. I will tell the crawl honestly. It was 12 minutes of my grandmother's narrow dark, with the iron getting warmer around us. 4 humans and 1 princess on hands and knees, and the only voice in my head that mattered was Mercer's from a season of lamplit watches. Hot air rises, stay low, trust the shoring, she built for load, count your turnings, the dark lies but the count doesn't. I counted. I had been counting things in that palace all my life, pillars, winters, regrets, and it had always been the arithmetic of endurance. This was the first count that ever carried anyone anywhere. 3rd turning low water, the old queen's initials cut beside the vault door where her inspectors would see them coming through. We came out onto the gantry above the relief manifold, into heat like a hand on the face, and Mercer took one look at the valve bank below and said, very quietly, a word I will not enter into this account. The jammed seats had been helped, wedge collars, machine bright, seated down inside 4 valve bonnets where no honest part lives. The same tool chatter, when it all came to the bench later, as the ring that scalded coarse, set sometime in the past days by someone with access, patience, and a schedule. They had not wanted a scare this time. With the boilers chained at full draw and the reliefs pinned shut, the mains had been aimed deliberately at the only outcome left. A burst in the counterweight system on the last nights of the Concorde, the lock gates sagging on dead chains, the festival fleets of 40 houses grinding onto the sills as the basin emptied on the falling tide. Not an embarrassment, a catastrophe. With the foreign steam crew standing in the wreckage of a system, the whispers had spent weeks calling beyond them. Can you free the seats? I asked. With time, with the bonnets cool, yes. We have neither. Mercer was already moving along the gantry, hand near the iron, reading temperatures the way other men read print. So we don't free them, we go around them. The standpipe. He pointed down the gallery to the great vertical main rising into shadow, my grandmother's emergency spillway, built to dump steam to the open sky above the seawall if all else failed, and chained out of service 2 generations ago when a court that no longer understood its own keel decided the venting plume frightened festival crowds. Hand wheels at the head, top of the ladderway. If the wheel still turns, the line still vents. Briggs kills the fire, we open the sky, the mains breathe, your locks live till morning. Then it's a bench job. And if the wheel doesn't turn, it'll turn. He was at the ladderway already. It's her iron. It turned. I want that entered plainly, because everything that has been said about that night in the years since, and the court, which would not stand for me, has since proven unable to sit down when the story is told, comes down to a simpler thing than the songs allow. Her iron held, and his crew was enough, and the wheel turned. But it turned hard, fouled with 2 generations of chain rust, and it turned at the head of a ladderway directly above the manifold, where the gantry air was past bearing, and the wheel rim itself ran hot enough to strip a bare palm. And the man who reached it first was Mercer, who had given his gloves to a fitter whose own had torn in the crawl. I was 1 rung below him. I watched him look at the wheel that had to turn now, with the needles climbing toward the red on the gauge bolted beside it, and I watched him square up to burn his hands to the bone on it, and I did the only purely sensible thing I have ever been praised for. I came up the last rung, put my shoulder under his arm, and laid my hands on the rim. My gloves, his gloves, the gloves that had lived in my cloak lining since the first day at the rail. And under the gloves, my hands, the left one rafted, both of them 5 years past, the kind of caution smooth skin is born to, both of them trained on a season of his valves. Scar tissue burns slower than it warns you, I said, which was not what he had taught me, and was a joke and was the truth of that exact moment. Spare nerves, you said, call the turns. There is a kind of look a man gives you when he revises, completely and on the spot, his estimate of what a structure will bear. I had waited all my life for someone in Tidereach to look at me like that. It is fitting past all my deserving that when it finally came, my hair was scorched, the air was screaming, and I had just misquoted him to his face. Half turns, Mercer said, taking grip beside me, his bare hands wrapped in the stripped-off shirt Briggs's runner had thrown up the ladder. On my count. She'll fight to the last quarter, and then she'll sing. Ready, princess? I was built for load, I said. Count. We turned it together, half turn by half turn, my grandmother's wheel against my grandmother's steam, the rim's heat crawling through the leather into my scars like an old debt being read aloud, and then at the last quarter, exactly as he'd promised, the fight went out of it, and the standpipe drew breath for the first time in 60 years. The roar of it came up through our boots and bones, and far above us, over the seawall, over the moored fleets of 40 houses, a white plume went up into the night sky like a banner being planted, and every needle on the gallery board all down the line began slowly, gratefully to fall. Half the Concord saw the plume. By morning the other half had been told about it twice, and Tidereach woke into the particular weather that follows a near thing. Relief curdling into the search for someone to charge for the fear. And here is what I learned about my enemy that morning. His nerve was real. A lesser conspirator, finding his catastrophe vented harmlessly into the night sky, would have gone quiet to count his exposure. Cassivar attacked at once in full court, with the confidence of a man who had already written the verdict and saw no reason to waste it. He stood before my father's seat an hour after the morning bell, with delegations of 40 houses packed to the walls, and he was magnificent. Sorrowful, measured, every inch the friend of House Veyroon bearing hard truths. The old works had failed catastrophically in the night, failed twice over, boilers and reliefs together, and only the chance of an antique spillway had spared the fleets. The system was beyond the legation crew. The scalding of an honest Verfitter had warned them all weeks ago. He did not accuse the humans of malice. He was generous. He was reasonable. He accused them merely of being 9 tired men holding back a sea. And so, for the safety of 40 houses, House Othran formally petitioned. The legation contract dissolved, the foreign crew escorted out before worse came, and the deepwater locks placed under Othran fleet engineers in trust. Pending, he said, with a bow toward the dais and the smallest turn of his eyes to me, the joyful alliance of houses to be sworn at tomorrow's water oaths, which would make the trust a family matter. It was beautifully built. Every fact in it was true and every conclusion was a lie, and the hall was nodding. I watched my father, who had been handed in one speech a rescue from his own dying machinery, a manager for his scandal, and a wedding already paid for. And I watched him nod too, slowly, the nod of a king being moved by a current he had no charts against. The doors of the Pearl Hall opened. The herald, flustered, had not struck the bell because what came through the doors was not on his schedule. The steam crew of the Terran legation, 9 humans still gray with the night's work, coarse and 3 palace fitters behind them, and between Mercer and Briggs, carried on a length of dock canvas like something recovered from a wreck, the disassembled bonnets of the Western Relief manifold. They came up the center of the hall in their boots, and on his way past the engineer's alcove, Mercer caught my eye for one flat second, and I understood. He had timed it. He had let Cassivar build the whole gallows in public before walking in with the lumber receipts. "Majesty," he said into the noise, not loudly, and the noise gave up. "Your hall's about to vote on the cause of last night's failure. Thought you'd want to see the cause first. It's small, travels well." And he had Briggs lay the canvas on the floor stones of the Pearl Hall in front of the assembled water of the Western Sea, and unwrap 4 valve bonnets and 4 bright machined wedge collars, and beside them the bagged seat ring that had scalded coarse, and beside that his log, open to the night of the first failure, the unbroken stitching of dates and torque readings, and witnessed entries running right up to that morning. What followed took the rest of the day, and I will spare this account the full anatomy of a conspiracy being autopsied in public, the summoned metallurgists, the matched tool chatter under the lens, the Othran dredge yard's batch stamp found inside a wedge collar's bore where the machinist had not thought anyone would ever look, because no one ever looks inside the murder weapon's bones except a man who has spent 40 years checking the work and not the reputation. I will record only the 2 moments that decided it. The first was Master Tovin breaking. He had been sent, mid-afternoon, to fetch documents that would establish the wedge collars were common salvage stock. He was escorted, because by then the admirals were insisting on escorts, and at the west door, with the documents unfetched, he made a quiet, reasonable, fatal attempt to keep walking toward the harbor. They brought him back into a silent hall, and Cassivar turned to look at his aide with exactly the right expression of baffled grief, and Tovin, narrow, gray, a surveyor of pooling information who had measured precisely where all of this was now flowing, looked back at his lord and chose. The keeper's clerks took his statement until dark. The second was Cassivar's last maneuver, and it was aimed at me, and it is the reason this account exists. Cornered, his aide confessing, his batch stamps on the table, his petition dead, he did what his kind does at the end. He reached for the oldest weapon in the hall, the one that had never once failed against me. He turned from the wreck of his case, found me on the dais steps, and let the court see him measure my face, scarred side first, with all the warmth finally drained out of his eyes and something honest underneath it at last. "Majesty," he said to my father, while looking at me, "settle this between our houses quietly, and Othran's friendship survives the indiscretions of its servants. Press it, and I will spend 10 years and the worth of my fleet in every court and harbor of the Western Sea, and what they will all remember at the end is not collars and bonnets. It is that Veyroon tried to anchor its treaty on that." The pause was a craftsman's pause. "On a cinder no tide will wash clean. Look at her, Majesty. You have looked away for 5 years yourself. 40 houses just spent a season doing the same. That is the asset you would go to war for. A marked daughter the gulls grieve over, whose own hall will not stand when she stopped talking." I did not know it would be my voice. I had planned words for the next night, for the oaths, for the petition Anev had docketed. I had built that load path bolt by bolt and meant to walk it in order. But there are moments the structure chooses for itself, and I was already 2 steps down from the dais with my face up and the whole Western Sea watching. And the strange thing, the thing I had not engineered and could not have, was that my voice came out the way iron stays level. "You have made one true argument today, my lord, and you have just made it again, that this court looks away from me, that my own hall sits. You built your whole season on it. The contract, the physicians, the annexes, the collars. Every wager you placed was the same wager, that no one in Reach would ever stand up for the burned one. I came down the last step, onto the floor stones, onto his ground, and I heard my grandmother's paragraph in my chest like a second heart. You should have studied the house you were robbing. We seat this court in a hall my grandmother's burned ones built, and tomorrow night, under the water oaths you wanted for a cage, I am going to ask this hall a question about that in my own voice, under a law that has been waiting for you in the registry since before either of us was born. Until then," and I gave him the bow, the precise, gracious fleet launch bow, returned at last with the interest of a season. "Be patient, my lord, as you once asked of me." My father did not press the case quietly. "Whatever else is written of King Othal, and I have written hard things of him in this account, and stand by them, he was, at the end of the day on which a man had threatened his house in his own hall, of Veyroon. Cassivar of Othran left Reach before the night tide under treaty arrest, his fleet's moorings forfeit to the Concord's judgment, his clerk's beautiful contract entering the registry after all, as evidence. The hall emptied around its own uproar, and my father stood alone by his seat for a long time, an old king looking at the burned daughter he had spent a season pricing, and what was in his face was not yet recognition. It was the beginning of arithmetic. It was a man checking, for the first time in 5 years, whether the floor he had built his house on was level. "What law," he said at last, "has been waiting in my registry?" "Grandmother's," I said. "Now, tomorrow, father, I'll cite it standing." That night I went down to the galleries one more time. The crew was at the benches, rebuilding the manifold seats by lamplight, too tired for ceremony, which is why I loved them. Mercer's hands were dressed in clean bandage. The shirt wrapping had not been quite enough. The wheel had taken its tithe of him after all, and he worked anyway, slower, directing Briggs's wrenches with a tilted chin. I took my place at the bench without asking and held the bonnet steady for them, gloved. And for an hour nobody mentioned courts or contracts or tomorrows, and it was the best hour of the whole account. At the end of it Mercer walked me to the spiral stair, and stopped and stood there turning something over, and for the first time since I had known him the flat voice took on a careful grade, like a man laying a load path through ground he did not trust himself on. "Tomorrow when you cite your grandmother," he said, "the right says you choose in your own voice before the court. I've read it now. Anav let me into the registry, which I gather is a privilege. A pause engineered. Whatever you choose, whoever you choose, or nobody at all, the crew stands." "I stand. That's not contingent, princess. There's no clause on it. I wanted that entered in your log before the hall makes its noise. 5 years I had been told what I was worth, in lenses and annexes and veils. Here was a man with burned hands entering an unconditional into my log, asking nothing, on the eve of the only night that would ever matter, and going back to his bench. I climbed all 14 flights with my heart making a sound like warm iron stretching, and I knew, somewhere on the stairs, with no drama at all, the way you know a wheel will turn, it's her iron. I knew exactly whom I was going to choose. The night of the water oaths, the Pearl Hall held more of the Western Sea than it had held in 9 years. 40 houses, the Concord delegations, the harbor masters and pilots called up from below the salt because the night's business touched every hull they piloted. The treaty was sworn first, as it had to be. The tolls renewed, the water oaths given house by house, hands wet from the basin bowl in the old way. My father took the oaths from his seat with his face in order and his arithmetic, I could see, still running. There had been no betrothal reading scheduled into the ceremony. There was instead a docket entry in a keeper's stitching hand for the hearing of a petition under Crown grant. Anav read the summons the way he did everything, dry as salt-cured paper and twice as durable. Petition of Ilzavel, daughter of House Verun, under the grant of Queen Maravel in the 11th year of the Locks, the right of the flame-born. The petitioner will stand. I stood. I had entered the hall an hour before to the court's usual seated weather, and I had walked the 14 pillars without counting them. And now I stood alone on the floor stones where the wedge collars had lain, in plain dress, no veil, my hair pinned back off the scarred side, because if the next minutes were going to be decided by my face, then the court would decide them looking at all of it. The rite requires the fire be witnessed, Anav read, and the service sworn to before the court by those who saw it. Who rises to swear? You build a load path bolt by bolt, and then the moment comes when you take the props out and learn what it actually carries. I had 11 names on the docket. What I did not have, what no one in that hall had, was any idea of what the 400 would do, and I stood in the silence after Anavev's question with my face up and my heart making its iron sounds, and I will tell the truth of that silence. It lasted 3 seconds, and it was longer than the fire. Admiral Veshtain rose first. 90 years old, lock warden of the South Caisson, she came up out of her seat like a gate opening on old chains, and her voice filled the hall from the keel up. I was warden of the Basin Watch 5 years past, when the pleasure barge took fire at the spring moorings. I signed the rolls. I swear to the court that the Lady Ilzavel entered that fire unordered, for the blood of this house, and bore it out alive in her arms, and bears the proof of her service upon her body to this hour. I have watched this court fail to stand for her for 5 years. The old eyes raked the hall, lieutenant to the last. I correct my own failure tonight. Corse rose, his arms still dressed, and swore in Basin dialect, plain as a cleat. He had been on the water that day. He had seen the princess come out of the smoke with the child wrapped in her own cloak, her own back burning. Basin men remembered. Pell rose from among the household staff, 16, ears scarlet, word perfect on the oath she had asked me to teach her, and swore that she had not seen the fire, and was not a witness to the fire, and asked the keeper's leave to swear instead that she had seen what came after. 5 years of a lady carrying her service unthanked through a house that warmed every wing but hers. Anav, magnificent fossil, ruled the oath admissible under the grant's plain text, service being a continuing condition. And then it happened, the thing I had built no path for. A harbor master of the Western Shelf rose unscheduled and swore his pilot still used the channel soundings the Lady Ilzavel had drawn for the basin in her own hand, and that competence was service. One of the night crew fitters rose and swore to the crawl, the wheel, the standpipe, the plume that had spared 40 fleets. Last night's fire, he said flatly, since the grant don't say which fire. Saveth rose from below the dais, my unburned sister, and the hall went very quiet, because everyone knew what she was witness to. She did not give it as testimony. She gave it standing straight as a mast with her hands unfisted at last, looking not at the keeper but at the 400. I was 6, she said. The smoke had me. Everyone on that basin was screaming, and the only person walking in was my sister. She's been walking into this hall alone the same way for 5 years, and you have all sat there the way I sat there, and I am done sitting. That is my whole oath, keeper. She walked in for me. I stand for her. They rose and rose after that. Not all at once, and not all of them. The truth of any hall, in spreading patches like floodwater finding its level. The lower benches first, harbor masters and pilots hammering up out of their seats, then the old service houses, then delegations whose veterans held pensions on my grandmother's right and knew exactly which branch of law was bearing their own weight, and then lords I had never once seen look directly at me, rising because the tide around them had turned, and standing still meant being seen above the water. I stood on the floor stones and watched 5 years of seated weather break, and I would be lying if I said it felt like victory. It felt like the standpipe. 60 years chained, then opened, and the roar was just pressure going where it should always have been allowed to go. My father rose last. That, too, I record plainly, because the songs have him leaping up first, and the songs are wrong and the truth is better. He waited until the hall was on its feet around him, and his own arithmetic had nowhere left to stand. And then King Othel of the Vare stood up in front of the Western Sea for the daughter he had priced, and the hall heard what it cost him in the grain of his voice, and the cost was the worth of it. The crown, he said, swears with the witnesses. The crown was on the basin that day. A breath. The crown has been 5 years remembering it. The grant is honored. The right of the flame-born holds. Then the petitioner holds her lands and her person in her own name, Anav read, and his dry voice put the next words up like a wheel coming to its last quarter turn, and shall be contracted in marriage to no house and no man, save by her own consent, spoken in her own voice before this court. Does the petitioner speak? The hall went down to its bones. 40 houses standing, and not a sound in 14 pillars length, and every eye in the Western Sea on the burned one who had just become, in the space of one docket entry, the freest woman on Cathrid and the holder of the deep-water locks in her own right. I could have said nothing. The right asks nothing. I had planned, through all the building of it, to say nothing, to take my name and my locks and let that be the whole of the night's astonishment. But I had a sentence entered in my log that was not contingent, and a hall full of water that had finally remembered how to rise, and I have never once in my life left a truthy thing unsaid below the waterline where it was safe. So I turned from the dais and looked down the standing rows to the engineer's alcove, where the Terran legation stood in their cleanest coats, to the man at the front of them with his hands in white bandage and his gloves folded in, his belt, who had been on his feet since the doors opened, the way he had been on his feet the first morning, when standing for me was a thing one person in the world did. 5 years ago, no one in this hall stood when I entered, I said to all of them, looking at him. 1 year ago, one man did. He was not ordered to. He gained nothing by it. He saw the daughter of this house, when this house could not look at her, and he handed her a pair of work gloves and told her fire was not owed any more of her. My voice held her iron. This court knows him. He kept your water where you wanted it. He pulled your fleets back off the sills 2 nights ago with his bare hands on a 60-year wheel. He is not of the 40 houses. He can recite no line but the line of every hand that taught him his craft, and I have stood in the deep rooms of this palace and learned that there is no older blood on this world than that. The right is mine tonight, and this is my voice, and the court is my witness. I came down the hall to the alcove rail where he stood very still, watching me the way he watched a structure revise his estimate of it upward forever. Daniel Mercer, I hold my lands, my locks, and my name in my own right. Share them with me. For a moment, the man who always had a level sentence ready had nothing at all. Then he wiped his bandaged palm on his coat out of pure habit, as if to give me a clean hand for the bargain, and the hall caught its first sound back, a ripple of something that was half laughter and half weeping and entirely standing. You know what you're claiming, he said quietly. I'm 44. I'm a freight driver's son. I fix old steam. I was built old steam, I said. Count. Then yes, said Mercer, in exactly the voice he used for pressure ratings, taking my gloved hand in his bandaged one at the rail, before the standing water of the Western Sea. On one condition, Princess. The wedding small and the honeymoons in the galleries. Lock 3's still a bench job. The Pearl Hall, 400 strong and on its feet, broke into the kind of roar my grandmother's standpipe would have recognized. Old Veshtain was heard to say it was the only sensible match the court had produced in 50 years. The treaty clerks, may the tide keep them, recorded the consent in the Concord's own annex, where it sits to this hour beside the tolls and the water oaths, load-bearing now, as Anav likes to say, strike it and bring your own wall down. We were married in the spring, small as promised, basin men, fitters, the legation, my sister, my father, one ancient admiral, one ancient keeper, and Pell, who stood through the whole of it like a mast and cried like a scupper. I kept my name and my locks. He kept his contract and his crew. The court, which had spent 5 years unable to look at me, has spent every year since unable to look away, and I have learned to carry that too. It is only heat. The old works are being rebuilt now, properly, with Vera apprentices at human benches, my grandmother's iron taught to a new generation in both species' hands, because a house that cannot service its own keel does not deserve the water it floats on. I sit on the Concord's Lock Commission. My husband files reports that no longer thin as they rise. They come straight to me, and heat goes to every wing. But this account began with a hall that would not stand, and so I will end it where I actually end, most evenings, when the commissions and the courts are done, on the gantry above Lock 3, below the waterline, where the gauges have no opinion of my face and never did. He is usually at the rail listening to the iron. There are 2 pairs of work gloves hanging by the board now, his and mine are no longer his cast-offs. He had them made to my hands. Graft and all, the only gloves on Cathrid cut for a flame-born grip. The first time I came down after the wedding, he heard me on the grating and got to his feet. Up, eyes forward, the whole ordinary impossible motion of it, exactly as he had on a morning when 400 people stayed in their seats. Sit down, Mercer, I told him. You never have to stand for me again. The entire Western Sea does it now. You've been relieved. He stood anyway, the way her iron holds, and handed me my gloves off the hook. I know, he said. I was just never doing it because they wouldn't. I take that sentence with me everywhere I go in this life. Up all 14 flights, through every hall on the Western Sea, past every eye that flinches and every eye that doesn't. The court stands for me now, and I have learned what that is worth, which is something. But one man stood when it bought him nothing and gave me his gloves and taught me my own grandmother's iron, and that is worth the water it floats on. That is worth everything that floats.